Hello. Can we settle down? All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the series of Perspective Lectures by CFP. Today, our guest here is Ammel Sharon, the director of QAMRA Archival Project at the National Law School of Indian University, Bangalore. QAMRA stands for the Queer Archive for Memory, Reflection, and Activism. She is the co-director at the Writing Center, NLSIU, and a PhD candidate in history at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. She's with us today to talk about the various developments in research through the emergence of a queer archive in India. Let's all welcome her with a round of applause, please.
Good evening. I'll start with a trailer that we usually play about some of the people in the QAMRA archive, and then I'll go into my presentation. Thank you for coming. I've heard that some of you, or maybe all of you, have things to do with your seniors in about an hour or so. So I'll try not to take too much time. But I'm really glad to see so many of you here. I'm going to do 4 things in my talk today. I'm going to introduce the QAMRA archive. I'll talk about how it emerged and take you through a few of our collections. Then I'll discuss what I mean by keeping time, which is the title of my talk, and how it relates to the archives. I also want to think a little bit with you about what happens when a counter archives comes into a respected institution like the National Law School. And finally, I'll end with a few dilemmas and then that we have at QAMRA, and we can open it up for discussion. So I hope that sounds okay. So, to start with, the idea of a queer archive, and by queer archives I mean it's an archives of gender and sexuality, a human rights archive. I came into QAMRA, which is the queer archive for memory, reflection, and activism, in November 2022. It's a long name, and it's sort of intimidating for me because it's a large mandate. What is an archives that's also activist? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But the idea of this queer archives based on gender and sexuality, particularly marginalized genders and sexualities, emerged during a case in the Supreme Court. Some of you may know it. It is the Suresh Kumar Kaushal case, which was decided in 2013. Many of you know that in 2009, the Delhi High Court had read down Section 377. Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code had sort of made illegal sexual acts against the order of nature. And there was a landmark judgment at the Delhi High Court, which came about after tons of consultations, mobilizations, etc. across the country. But in 2013, there was an appeal. Suresh Kumar Kaushal, an astrologer, went to the Supreme Court and appealed. And the activists and lawyers who were, part of that movement became quite uneasy by some of the questions that the judges were asking during the case. So even before the judgment was pronounced, there was a queer archiving workshop that took place in 2013 in Bangalore. And you have a number of people who have been sort of court travelers, who have also been archivists, who are part of this. And they felt that if the court seems to think that homosexuals and queer persons and trans persons are some kind of minuscule minority, have no relation to Section 377, then it's sort of frustrating that we have to continue to justify our existence time and time and again. And so T. Jayashree, a filmmaker who had been working on public health, access to medicine, AIDS, human rights, began to film petitioners, lawyers, activists in Delhi and in other places. And this became one of our founding collections, the Oral History Collection, which is also something that most people who are sort of new to queer sexualities or narratives around them or activism around them in India sort of come and familiarize themselves with before going to the other collections. And so in 2013, when the Supreme Court reinstated Section 377, there was a backlash from queer groups across the country. You really get a sense of the energy and the anger in some of the photographs that we have at the archives. This slogan, "No going back," was very prominent. And in 2017, all these longtime friends, mostly in Bangalore, but also in other places, and every city and every town has its own distinctive queer culture. So mostly in Bangalore, they felt like these records, T. Jayashree's films, unedited footage, a very important organization called Sangama that started in 1998 in Bangalore, that had mobilized Hijra groups, Jogappas, queer people who had run away from home, had done a lot of work in crisis intervention, did a lot of work interfacing with arms of government like the police. So there were those records, and as you know, NGOs find it difficult to maintain records. They sort of collect things over time. Many of us do in our own houses, I suppose. What do you do with like stacks of paper over time? So those also came into QAMRA in 2017 when they decided that all of this stuff could become an archive. And the idea was that these records of queer life, queer loss, suicides, queer emotions, feelings, be recognized in a place that's safe, that's respected, and that can be made available to the public. And so in 2017, QAMRA was established. Sometimes I think if there was no reflection, it would have been QAMA, Queer Archive for Memory and Activism, which would have also been a great name. But QAMRA, as you know, it means a room where records can be held. It's also sort of etymologically related to camera, which, because we are a multimedia archive, we have audiovisual material, just works very well. And then the Navdeep Singh Johar judgment, which finally decriminalized queer relations, same-sex relations, came out in 2018, a year after the archive was set up. And so the archive really emerges, QAMRA emerges as a counter-archive. And I just wanted to note that the archive was set up because of long-standing friendships and co-travelers who just put their lives at risk, went to court, spoke on camera, really sort of outed themselves in a very public way. There was so much media attention. And all of this sort of led to the creation of the archive. I want to take you through some of the collections we have. So both these are from the Sangama collection that I spoke about earlier. This is from 2003. So you have these parchas. That one is about Cubbon Park in Lal Bagh. If people are familiar with Bangalore, the parks are really very integral to the city. There were important cruising areas also where people met each other, but have since become quite sanitized spaces. So people call this ephemera. If you go to an archives which has records, the archives, can you think of any archives apart from the CEPT archives, which some of you may have visited, some of you may not, but certainly will visit now. Can you think of any other archives that you've come across in India or elsewhere? Just through any names. The partition archives, where are they? What kind of archives are they? Yes. Yes. That's right. There are yes. So there are many like now digital archives. It's a good place for people to like post their memories and have them read by people. And the partition archives came about many, many decades, I think, after partition itself, which says something about trauma. Any other archives that we can think about? The National Archives of India, sometimes called the Memory of the Nation. State archives. Ashoka University has archives of contemporary India. Anyway, so if you go into the National Archives of India, which is where all the state records go, you'll find that they're typically tend to be quite administrative. If you go to any district office, any government office, you'll see lots of files. Such stuff, pamphlets, brochures are considered ephemera. But for queer groups who are trying to sort of put out some of their messaging, these things become integral, right? Things that are considered daily, often printed on cheap paper, not very expensive, become integral to queer memory and queer chronicles. This is also from the Sangama collection, and you can see the booklet is about AIDS, and you know, for queer sexuality, some of the first visibility came about through funding for AIDS. It's wonderful, just the energy and the protest of the pamphlet is quite lovely. That's Sangamitra, one of the magazines from a group called Good As You, or GAY, Good As You, that's celebrating 30 years this year. It's also issued a call if anyone is interested in writing for this magazine based in Bangalore. So we have a number of magazines from India, but also across the world, from the 80s onward. This, in fact, is from a collection from Gujarat. This is the Maya Sharma Indra Pathak collection from Baroda. Maya Sharma has been an important activist. Indra Pathak has been in the labor movement and also in the sexuality and gender rights movement. It's a fun pamphlet. This is about Stree Sangam, women coming together. Stree Sangam invites you to the second, yes, we've finally gotten our act together. National gathering of women who love women. So there's also always a little bit of humor that we can associate with this wonderful collective called Stree Sangam that was based in Bombay. So we're very happy to have stuff like this, just people getting together. And one can imagine that in the 1990s, the idea, before many people had the internet, where did queer people meet, right? And how did they even have a sense that people would come for like a few days? So these are stories that are still also waiting to be told. The material is in the archives. This I thought would be interesting. It's in Gujarati. This is Utkarsh Saxena and his partner, who were petitioners in the marriage equality case that recently went to the Supreme Court. So we have the marriage equality collection, as well as the case files of the 377 collection, so the legal records. Some of you may know that usually when people are talking about cases, they're usually talking about the judgments in the case. And that is usually in the voice of the judge. But the case files give you the voices of the petitioners, the affidavits. It just brings alive a whole lot of other perspectives, the research that people have done, and so on. So we have all of those cases. We have the written submissions. And this is something more contemporary, also from Vikalp in Baroda, Surviving a Pandemic, pictorial testimonies of transgender men. So it has a lot of visual stuff in it. as well. This is a photograph from 1980. Some of you may know the landmark book, Same-Sex Love in India, which brought together readings from ancient, medieval, and modern India on same-sex love. The word queer is not used by those editors. It's quite interesting. This is Ruth Vanitha, one of the editors, in 1980, when she was one of the co-founders of the Manushi magazine. You may have heard of it. It was one of the first feminist journal magazines in India. It galvanized voices like nothing had before. So this is her at her typewriter. And the archivist, of course, is always, has a sense of urgency. It's going looking for material before it's lost. And so I went to Professor Ruth Vanitha recently in Delhi, 40 years on. This is her with about 30 issues of the Manushi magazines that she gave us. And it's important because we do not have a very robust culture of archives till now. Much of this amazing material with sketches, with writings, poems, etc., tend to go to universities abroad. So she herself has promised and has already sent much of her collections to Cornell University. And so, the archivist then says, whatever we can keep for our students and our researchers, we will. So she's given us quite a lot, including photographs of her family, her wife, her son, and the wedding program they had that they put together, which is quite a creative thing during their ceremony in the US. So what do I mean then by keeping time? How does an archive keep time? So one of the meanings of this phrase is to show the correct time, right? In the coming about of the QAMRA archive in 2017, one might say that this was the time of the queer and trans question. Just like maybe the 70s and 80s was the time of the women's question, right? Really organized a new way of seeing things, of approaching the world, and you could see it across media, across like literature, across public discourse. But to keep time is also to measure the passing of time. My 24-year-old colleague is often fascinated by the terminologies that they find in our records. F to M, for instance, right, already sounds so archaic to us, female to male, but it is sort of rampant in the records from the 90s and early 2000s. This terminology already sounds quite unfamiliar. Something that we did last year was to organize, keeping this notion of the passing of time and measuring time in mind, what we called an intergenerational dialogue between the Lesbian Her Story archives in New York City and the QAMRA archive. Now, the Lesbian Her Story archives, or LHA, was sort of founded 50 years ago, and they continue to use the word her story. I'm also a student of history, and to my mind, I would not use the word her story, but it's very interesting that this archive, set up in the 1970s, really came out of a specific kind of politics. It framed the world in a particular way. It challenged like the language of history, and that continues to give us some resources, right, that we continue to use in terms of feminist politics. And now the politics of a queer archive is quite different, I mean, even in its language. But we can see that this relationship between feminists and trans activists in the US has been quite strained. So one of the things we seek to do at QAMRA is to recognize dilemmas, to recognize antagonism between queer groups, or all kinds of groups, in fact, and to hold these dilemmas in the archive in a way that people who are sort of locked in tension together in life cannot probably sort of work through those problems. And we think that the archive can hold both voices together and have people come in and work with those records in a way that people who are sort of caught in the moment cannot. And I want to highlight some of these posters because each one is done by people, young people mainly, who come into the archive, spend some time, work with us, and really leave an impression. So the archive space that we have has all of these posters and a lot of visual material. This was done by my former colleague Siddharth Ganesh, who worked at QAMRA as an archivist for 3 years. We did something on documenting labor histories, because we have a number of scholars of labor law at NLS, and this was done by Jasoon Chelat, who works on labor law. This is done by my present colleague, Daya Ambirajan, who is now, Daya was an intern at that time. This was a fun, very moving online event, which we will put up soon, where Georgina Maddox, the art critic, took us to the arc of these artists' lives, and they were there as well, talking about how do we read their images over their careers of over 20 years. And this poster was done by Poojan Chaukhani, who is quadriplegic, and designs holding the stylus in her mouth. This is a very special one for us as well. And you can follow Poojan. I've put her Insta handle there, at Draftsmanship. Right. And so, to come to one of the final meanings of keeping time that I have in mind is that we measure time in order to make sure that an event happens within the time allowed, right? So we make sure that something happens, and that's when an archive becomes an activist archive. So what does it mean for record keepers to be activists? And that's also something I'd like to sort of explore in our discussion today. So these two facets, that an archive is alive to dilemmas, that it does not defend or glorify the records that it keeps, and that keeping records is not a passive activity. Like, boxes don't just come in and stay there and then we make them available, but it involves appraisal, it involves imagination, and it goes beyond custodianship in a way. Are concerns that structure our work at the archives. So I just want us to keep in mind that when I say archives, archives can be non-current records, records that are not being used by an organization or someone at this particular time. But there are also platforms and places and spaces, and that's something that some of you might be interested in. Next week I have a student who has a PhD, PhD scholar who's been looking at the architecture of queer spaces come into the archive and sort of tell us a little bit about what we might do for QAMRA as well, and you're all invited to come and sort of contribute and give us ideas. They can be online spaces, and they can be, of course, physical spaces, offline spaces. And archives are also organizations, which means that we have to sustain ourselves. We need to pay salaries. We need to make sure that, unlike programs, an archive is meant to last for decades together. Now this is, I don't know if any one of you recognizes this image, might know where it's from. This is a standard sort of image of, let's say, a government file room, right? What is the sense that it gives you when you look at this image? Anybody want to respond to this photograph? Yes? Unorganized, yeah, chaotic, unkempt, yeah, sure. Anything else? Old, yes, you really get a sense of the weight of time, that's right, perfect. And materiality, right? You get a sense of the weight of paper and this chaos, in a sense. Apparently, I mean, one gets a sense that things would be hard to retrieve. And of course, these are records of people, ordinary people's lives, and have a bearing on people's lives, right? This is a photograph from the famous photographer Dayanita Singh's series, File Room. And what she did with this is she did another series called Myself, Mona Ahmed, where she accompanied a Hijra woman called Mona, her friend, over 10 years and photographed her. It's a very moving series. And then inserts Mona into the file room image, right? And what it does is that it changes the photograph, right? And there are a number of ways that one might read it. I leave you to read it for yourselves. But this came as a sort of such a relief to me. I love this image because really queerness changes the way in which we understand a space. When I came into QAMRA, I had a lot of despair. Who is going to fund archives? Who is going to fund a queer archive, right? How do I sustain this? Who's going to come? Even researchers have so little sort of vocabulary, have an interest. What's going to happen to this archive? And when I saw this image, I was sort of freed of that despair, because queerness need not fit into, boxes. And what are the symbols of archives today? Acid-free storage boxes. Where do these acid-free boxes come? Come mostly from Europe. They cost a bomb, right? Temperature control, humidity control. All of these are expensive things. And I was thinking, who's going to put in that sort of money and effort into a queer archive? But then, just watching this, looking at this image sort of gave me some kind of relief from having to compare and really thinking about what can a queer archive offer when it is marginalized, right? And that's a little bit that I want to talk about today. I'll come back to this because I'm not sure how much time I have, but this is a video of one of the founders of the Lesbian Her Stories Archives, who's now in her 80s, who is speaking about how their archive came about and her growing up in the 1950s in the McCarthy period. But we can come to this later. I want to talk a little bit about counter archives. See, QAMRA contains material from not just queer mobilization, but from different social movements, because queer activists were interested in human rights problems. And so I began to see the QAMRA archive as an important archive of post-colonial India. What do I mean by post-colonial? You know that the colonial government gathered a lot of information, right? It sought to govern people by gathering information in very intimate ways, in ways that were violent but intimate. And so you have photographs of, let's say, marginalized tribes, for instance. You have a lot of texts being translated in the 18th, 19th century, right? There's this wonderful term that the scholar, I think Bernard Cohen has, the language of command and the command of language. They were so invested in learning all sorts of languages in India in order to govern better, in order to be able to have command to rule. Now, when we think of what happens when a counter archives comes about, one that is not interested in ruling, right? How do we position it? And what happens when a counter archives comes into a respected institution like the National Law School? A German student came to me once and said, we tend to think that law schools are rather conservative places because they uphold the law. How is it that a queer archive has come into a law university? I think this is an interesting question that Anne Svetkovich also asks in the US context. She asks, what happens when a grassroots lesbian feminist archive finds its way to the special collections of a major university research library? Does it lose its counter-archival aura? Or can it carry its powers of critical intervention into new spaces? So the Lesbian Her Stories archives remain separate from the university. They have their own building. But another collection, the Laura Mazer collection, actually comes into one of the major universities. So I just want to take us through some of the things that we've done while at NLS. One is to say that a number of activists who were involved in queer activism came from the National Law School. They're alumni, they were in the cases, they have continued to be interested in the archives and have contributed to it. So there is, in a sense, an organic link between QAMRA and the National Law School. But there's something else about time, right? Queer folks don't, the time of queer lives is sort of different from the lives of heteronormativity. You don't get married, so you don't have those milestones. You may or may not have children. The state makes it quite difficult. So what are the milestones you have? The idea of living a life outside of heteronormative time then also has to be recorded. And so one of my colleagues said, and we were just, sort of bantering, and we thought the idea of play becomes quite important. And people don't talk enough about play in adult life. And so, and we were also thinking, because we do have a lot of visual material, that we should get into soft sculpture. And my colleague said, I will crochet a rooster for you. And I thought this was wonderful. It was suggestive, it's colorful. It also creates a different kind of affective response. This notion of a petting zoo at a university seems almost outlandish, but it's something that we're working towards, to think about play, queerness, and transforming spaces. Another thing that QAMRA was involved in was, some of you may know, some may not, that 2023 last year was the centenary year of the Legal Practitioners Women Act. This act in 1923 finally allowed women to appear in court and fight cases. This went almost unmentioned in India last year, but what we did was we wrote to Oxford University, where Cornelia Sorabji, one of the first advocates in India, a very interesting woman, did a lot of work with Parda Nasheens, a complicated woman, studied, and they shared records of her college life with us, photographs, marks, cards, etc. And we put this up on campus when the Chief Justice, D.Y. Chandrachud, came, and he also spoke about Cornelia Sorabji in a speech that was published in various places. And so this is what a queer archive brings to a law university, an archival imagination. This is Cornelia Sorabji's nephew, who's a philosopher, Richard Sorabji at Oxford University, sharing some photographs of him as a child with his mother. They're not very good photographs, but they're very affective ones as well. And then we do some amount of teaching. So we teach an archives-based course where students get to work with material, but are also introduced to basic archival skills, and also conceptualizing archives in this dynamic time. It really seems like we're at a time in India where everyone seems to be wanting to archive things. And when I say archiving, I mean the verb archiving, right? Everyone is setting up archives. CEPT has its own archives. AU might have its own archives, Ashoka University has its own archives, Godrej University has its archives. What is the point of all of this archiving? What is this impulse, right? And Anne Laura Stoller, a very interesting and important historian, says that maybe this archiving is the political practice of our time. We don't know if people are going into those archives, we don't know if research is coming out of them, but the archiving itself as a verb appears to be something that everyone seems to be invested in today. One of the things that we found quite useful is that when people are sort of uncomfortable or unfamiliar with queer terminology, queer life, queer situations, what we do is we put our newspaper clippings and have people sort of sort, catalog, and when you have like news in your hands, it's very difficult to sort of ignore. And we found these archival workshops quite interesting. And finally, to come to my last slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about access and dilemmas of access, because we're at a time where access is available at the click of a button. Access to archives is expected, wherever people might be. Now, we're a small archives. For a long time, we simply didn't know who was going to fund us, whether we'd sustain over the next year. And there's an expectation that because we are an archive of marginality, we must make our material available to everyone. Now, most archives usually charge fees, but the expectation is that QAMRA makes its material available. I think we've taken a slightly different approach, because a lot of young people have given their voices, their lives, the stories of their lives to QAMRA. A lot of it is intimate and sensitive material, and we prefer that this material not go digital very quickly, that we respect and honor the people in the archive and the details of their lives. Many of them are still young. We don't know if things go viral, things can be be controversial in a way that might cause anxiety for people if they circulate irresponsibly. So we are a physical archive. And we like it when people come in and access our materials, because that also gives us a chance to have conversations. And so then what we have seen is people become invested and feel responsible for the archives themselves and become advocates of QAMRA, rather than having an impersonal sort of relationship over the internet with some object, right? Here there is a sort of relationship with the institution and interest in sustaining it. And we've seen that word of mouth spreads when people come and have conversations with us. In the early 1980s, there was this idea of archives being in a post-custodial era. The idea that archives need not be custodians of their material, not control it, but rather, maybe in like places where there are no resources, archives can facilitate access, can sort of help archives in, let's say, developing countries digitize their material. And so the material doesn't come into first world countries, as it often does, but remains in the places where it is sort of important for local communities. You might have heard of the British Library Endangered Archives Program. There's the Modern Endangered Archives Program, which allows digitization, and some of you may be interested in applying for such grants. But the condition is that all of that material be made public online. And that, again, is something that we are not quite comfortable doing, because not all archives in the US and the UK, for example, make all their material available online. We are not comfortable making sensitive material, crisis intervention records, records of abuse and violence available, because these are people's lives and bodies. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about what is called metadata. When material comes into the archive, the difference between an archive and documentation is that we have an impersonal system by which someone can ask for something, look through it in a catalog, and then it can be retrieved easily. If a collection is in an individual's house, then it's only that individual who has a logic of how things are arranged. But if you have an impersonal catalog system, then anyone can sort of retrieve material, search and retrieve material. But a catalog is also a narrative. It arranges records in a particular way. It speaks of the life of those records in a particular way. And I want to talk a little bit about the dilemma that a queer archive has. A lot of queer people are not out, and so to name people in the archive can become problematic. Some people transition from one gender to the other. We have records of people before they transitioned. And then once people transition, the fact or the visual fact of their bodies, their names, their dead names becomes quite something that provokes anxiety and a whole lot of other feelings that may not be comfortable. And so what does a queer archive do? What does it put into its catalogs that makes things searchable? And does an archive then destroy its records that it has collected? What would it mean for, let's say, the National Archives of India to destroy its own memories, right? And so this is something that is very particular to a queer archive, and which is an ethical question. How should people be represented in a queer archive when lives are changing? Is consent something that one takes only once in one's life, or is it a dynamic thing? These are questions that a queer archive can pose, and I think is important for all archives to sort of keep in mind. How much time do I have? So what I'm going to do is play a video of Joan Nessel, who is the founder of the Lesbian Her Stories Archives. One of the things QAMRA is interested in is in collaboration and really holding voices of other archives together. And so this is an older archive, and I thought it would be special perhaps to listen to the experiences of an archive that came up in the 1970s. So it's a 12-minute video, but Joan Nessel is very charismatic, is a wonderful writer of sexuality, porn, affection, love, and you might be interested in looking her writings up.
I do see parallels, or I do see, what was this? Appeared in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee in Washington. What was this? Okay, so Joseph McCarthy, perhaps I should I think he was leading. I mean, in a way, he prefigures what's happening in America now. And yes, I do, I know I do see parallels, or I do see threats on the horizon of our countries, even though our histories are so different. But, America had her hand in everything. So it's, but, so McCarthy was calling people up in front of an investigative committee. And this committee was used primarily against young left-wing people and people of color. So Paul Robeson Jr., Joanne, these are just names. They had traveled to China at a time when that was like, betraying everything American. So they were hauled up before this. Now, this committee had no legal power, but it had the power to shame. It had the power. People committed suicide at this time. A teacher in my school jumped because their addresses were published. They were fired from their jobs because being a communist was like being a queer. Do you know? You were a queer ideologically. And so I'm trying to think very clearly. I think in high school, I was involved. The first piece I ever wrote in my life was for this little literary journal in my high school, and it was a new high school. It was about why the United Nations should exist, because McCarthyism also was anti-internationalism, so those of us who wanted to defend the right of people to travel to visit communist countries, but just to be organized. You go to Washington, we organized buses that would leave 4 a.m. from our street outside our university, our college. Remember, this is a free public, and we attended those hearings, and I will never forget that, because that was my first moment of understanding how power, such in its ugly grip of power, and how it truly looked at other human beings and saw them as less than human. So the committee would call people in front of it and shame them and break their lives if they could. And I remember one point was an intermission, and we were small, maybe 30 of us, and this congressman and his wife were walking by, and one of them sort of, brushed past, and this congressman said, "Oh, don't touch them, they're the scum of the earth." Now, I was 17 when I heard that, so I said, okay, this is how it's going to be. This is how, anyway. Yes, a very profound education that stayed with me my whole time. That if you're going to be different, you're going to understand what dehumanization means. Right. In terms of where the archives comes from in the midst of, and that just continued. I mean, so I became a member of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and then we did freedom rides in Baltimore and the march from Selma to Montgomery and all of that, voter registration. But all of this was coming at the same time when I was going to a policed bar in the village.
A police bar.
I mean, a bar, a lesbian bar, the Sea Colony that I write about, that is also an illegal place, and it is regularly raided by the police. The police come for their payoffs. It's what you did when you were a queer in the 1950s and 60s, to be with other people like yourself. But all of these levels of experience, and I think this all leads to the archives, they're all talking to each other inside me. So when I was on the march from Selma to Montgomery, I was not out. I was out we had to fill little cards to be selected for the great honor to march to Montgomery, Alabama. I put feminist. I didn't come out as a lesbian. We'd have our gathering places. I mean, this was a time when people were being killed on the streets. But of course, anyway, I say that, and the whole history of being Black in America just comes to me because that was happening before and after the civil rights movement, and still. So, but my own reading was I felt my history at that moment of being a lesbian, of being queer, as I would have called it, the old queer, was not as important as the other history, which was a people's movement for liberation, the African American movement, just to vote. That was all that was about, just to vote. So all of that, how it comes together with the archives. In 1964, I got a job, my first and only actually teaching job. And this is in something called the SEEK program. Now, you've talked about the 60s being this time of radicalism. And yes, so there were, just as there was the right wing, there were pockets of progressive peoples. And in New York State, whereas there was something called the Black and Puerto Rican Congress, Caucus, and Shirley Chisholm, but Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman to run for president of the United States. And she was the one who created this educational program that in 1964 I started teaching for. And it was called SEEK, which means Search for Enlightened and Educated Knowledge. But it was for the children, the Black and brown and Hispanic, and then later in the years, all the migrants who didn't get a decent education in high school. And this was like an open admission program into the city university that had given me, Queens College. So I went back to where I had been educated in difference. And okay, you're being so kind and patient, and I'm sure this deluge of words.
But tell us a little bit about what the pedagogical approach was.
Yes. So that's the thing. So, and again, I knew nothing. So it was a radical program, and it uses Ivan Ilyich's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed as its basic text. And our teachers were made up of radicals from all over the world. So we had independentistas from Puerto Rico, we had the Ethiopian freedom fighters, we had Congolese freedom fighters who were also academics, who had been students and scholars. And so I met an incredibly community. So on one hand, I'm going to the bar at night, right? And then I'm started to teach in this program. And to prepare for my teaching, I read a book, and that book has stayed with me my whole life. So there's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And then I read Albert Memmi's The Colonizer and the Colonized. Now, I said the irony, my bar that I was going to, in which I watched police take their allotted amount of money, in which I watched butch women getting beaten up, in which we held each other tight in the face of it all just to have a place to be, is called the Sea Colony. I'm reading this book for my students because I'm meeting, my students are coming from all the colonized countries at least in, let me say, in the Northern Hemisphere, but from the Caribbean, from Central America, and America itself. So our students were primarily Black and Puerto Rican students at that time. And so I'm reading this book to better prepare myself for my teaching. And it prepared my soul for my future work with the archives. Because there's one paragraph that I quote endlessly. And when you're 82, you can really say it's endlessly. It never goes away. But it's the paragraph in which he talks about the colonized was never given an opportunity to have a sense, and I'll just change the pronoun to her, but I'll say they, of their own history. And then he says, at best, they're allowed a few names. It's almost the oppressor selects and says, this is who you should know for your history. But the last sentence in that paragraph was, the colonized are always condemned to lose their memory. And yes, it was for my students. Well, my students at that time, I taught there for 35 years. And my students taught, I learned from my colleagues, bodies of literature. I had been a literature major, an English major that I had never been taught. Worlds of new thinking and writing and possibilities of rebellion and resistance opened up. So that all came together in the 60s. Again, the fertile ground was laid for whatever insights I had by my life with my working class mother, who was also a whore from time to time, and my own work life, and then everything, the people's liberation movements that were all around me. And then in 19, so gay so there's women's liberation movement happening. There's gay liberation happening. Before it all is the civil rights movement. Before that, there's the anti-war movement. And all of this I was part of in small ways. I was never a big shot. It was just, my body was learning on the streets of my city how to take a position with others, always with others, comrades always, of defiance in a certain sense. And then the archives is a site where memory takes a position of defiance.
Okay. Hello. Okay, I'll stop there with this idea that from Albert Memmi's book on the colonized being condemned to lose their memory, and to sort of place QAMRA in that space where memory becomes a place for defiance. And end my presentation here with this idea that archives also have a radical pedagogical impetus, and that it's wonderful for archives to be at universities because there's a lot of energy, but also that it feeds into education. So I'll stop here. I think the final thing for putting you through like a 12-minute program is that archives are also exercises in patience. They're full of fragmentary records, and it takes time to really absorb and create your own narrative from what are very disparate sort of elements. So thank you. Hello.
Okay, we'll take questions now, if you have.
Sure. This is working, yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Firstly, totally had goosebumps during your talk. It was really wonderful. I had something to ask you along the similar lines that Professor Nessel was also talking about, the tensions that kind of come with intersections, the kind of how she always almost slipped into discussing other movements, how she almost slipped into talking about African American movements and tensions over there. And something that you also mentioned, the idea of not wanting to box queerness. But the idea of an archive is also boxing, right? So how do you deal with that? How do you kind of decide that the tensions between women's movements and sex workers' movements in India doesn't need to be mentioned in the queer archives or not? Because you cannot talk about sex workers and not talk about trans lives. So how does that kind of come about in your particular practice of archiving?
Yeah, thank you. Should I take a number of questions if people have more questions, or should I just respond? Any other questions? Okay, we'll take one more. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this is a really good question, I think, because intersections need not be antagonistic, of course, but often they can be, right? And as things play out in real time, those antagonisms get exacerbated. Now, the archivist is an active sort of agent because the archivist has to appraise material and see what can come in. But the collections themselves lend themselves to ideas that go beyond queerness also. And that's why we have like 4 folders of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, simply because, you know, like there were activists in the organizations who were also involved in mobilizing there. And then the archive doesn't take a stand about that. So when I mean active, doesn't mean that the archive has to take a position. It really is sort of also curating, right? Bringing to light in some sense, but or making visible or just sort of bringing attention to polyphonic voices in the archives. And so even if there are dilemmas, this is not something that the archive needs to get anxious about. There's something that Joe Nessel said to me, that let's say that this is an activist, the Lesbian Her Stories Archives is an activist archives, but if there were records of lesbian Nazis, for instance, they would be in the LHA, because we do not erase those histories. Those are histories that we also account for. So yeah. So in terms of counter archives, there are different ways we might think of counter. One could be encounter, right? That there is something unexpected that erupts through the work of the archive. But it also could be, at least in this case, that it came up in resistance to the certain voice of the law that was erasing queer lives. And that made it, in a sense, a counter archive, right? To say that this is not what the judges called a minuscule minority, right? That it is a significant, the lives are queer lives are significant, and there's a lot to learn from the richness of the lives and experiences and memories, and ought to be sort of honored in a certain way, but also worked with and recognized. So in that sense, in terms of the law, which is normative, this became a counter archive, but now it's an institutional archive. It's part of the National Law School, and we teach law students, and so does it continue to be a counter archive? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on what researchers make of it. So that's, yeah. Yes.
Firstly, thank you, ma'am, for your really eye-opening talk. So, actually, I was most interested in the activism angle of QAMRA, where when you had first shown the ephemera page of your presentation, I read that on top of one of the pamphlets, they were kind of, calling out to all the people in the group to go for that walk, which would be, for the garden. And, albeit a slightly cynical side of me was thinking that since this is going to be used for maybe activism, it needs to hold up in a court of law. And if it does hold up in a court of law, are there any problems you face where information like this, which is not 100% documented, it could be misconstrued? For example, another side could be taking, this call to action as some sort of riot, some sort of affair that, could end up violent when you call so many people. So have you faced any challenges, and is there a system that the archive has for things like this?
I'll try and answer this in 2 ways. One is that the collections themselves give us a sense of how the same material or the same sort of element under discussion can be construed in 2 different ways. So in the 377 archives, there's a petition from mental health practitioners, right, talking about how discrimination really affects queer folks. But on the other side, people who are arguing for continued criminalization are also using this mental health narrative in like their own way. And so this idea of mental health becomes a sort of discursive field where people of different persuasions are sort of putting their ideas forward, and really contradictory positions, right? And then it's sort of left to the lawyers to do that work. And at that time, these transcripts of what is happening in the court were not available. Now, because for some cases, the Supreme Court is making transcripts and videos available, but at that time, we didn't know. And so much happens, like this, it's such a dramatic space, right? That we had queer activists, like, at the end of the day, they would like give long sort of summaries to people outside the court and across the country, talking about what was happening in court, because not everyone could sit and listen. Or they would tweet. So just to sort of extrapolate from that and show how certain ideas come to be circulated. And there was another thing that I wanted to respond to, but I don't quite remember now. But yeah, so that is one way in which different, so the other is that all archives, especially if they contain sensitive material, have different levels of access. So sometimes people will say, I'm giving you my photographs, I don't want them reproduced without my permission. Some people say, I don't want this released while I'm alive. So archives wait for like 25 years, you know, in some cases, or more, whatever, the stipulated time, to make things available. And sometimes archives function as gatekeepers. So they sort of like try and see whether you're a credible researcher and then make things available. I mean, archives are very interesting ethnographic spaces as well. Different archives work differently. But they all have a sense of being custodians of their materials and having certain terms and conditions that they have to, you know, like keep in mind. And so we, for instance, don't make some material available. And of course, like our donors also have certain conditions for access. Yeah. How many of you have visited the CEPT archives? Does anyone want to say anything about them? Like what, I haven't visited the CEPT archives. What is in them? Objects? Paper? I mean, I hope that I've given a sense of what the QAMRA collections have and what can be done also with like the wide range of material that as someone who visits an archive, you can also just spend time with and write your own narrative of those objects about. So you may be interested in, of course, visiting the CEPT archives, but I welcome you to come to QAMRA because you are students of design and architecture and other things, that there might be something that you could tell us about what we could do in order to make our space more reflective and inclusive space.
Do we have any more questions? All right. Thank you so much, Ammel, because this talk about the archives and the QAMRA project was something that all of us have been unfamiliar with. And with this conversation, I am sure that your curious minds will go online and search for it and, you know, get deeper into the study. Thank you so much, Ammel. And can we have a round of applause for her again?